It is 11:38 a.m. on a clear Florida morning. The sky is the kind of blue that makes you believe anything is possible. 73 seconds. That is all the time it takes to turn the greatest achievement in human history into its most devastating failure. Over 2 billion people around the world are watching, live, as America's dream of routine space travel dies on national television. But here is what the history books never told you. The disaster had been predicted, the warnings had been filed, and the people who could have stopped it stayed silent. This is not just a story of a shuttle that broke apart. This is the story of what happens when institutions value schedules over lives. When 7 extraordinary people are betrayed, not by the universe, but by the very organization sworn to protect them. The Challenger disaster did not begin on January 28, 1986. It began years earlier, in boardrooms, in memos, and in a decision that still haunts NASA to this day. The year is 1972. Richard Nixon is in the White House, the Vietnam War is bleeding America dry, and NASA, fresh off its Apollo triumph, is fighting for its survival. The moon landings are over. The public has moved on. Congress is slashing budgets, and so NASA does something extraordinary. It sells a dream. The dream is called the Space Shuttle, a reusable spacecraft that will make going to space as routine as catching a flight from New York to Los Angeles. NASA tells Congress the shuttle will fly 50 times a year. It will pay for itself. It will carry satellites, experiments, and one day, ordinary civilians. Politicians love it. The budget is approved. You are standing in the NASA design offices in Houston in 1972, and the air smells of blueprints and ambition. Engineers are crowded around drafting tables, coffee cups everywhere. The energy is electric. These are the people who put humans on the moon. They believe they can do anything. But there is a problem hiding in plain sight, and almost nobody notices. The shuttle is being designed by the lowest bidder. Political compromises are being baked into the engineering from day one. A company called Morton Thiokol wins the contract to build the solid rocket boosters, the 2 giant cylinders strapped to the side of the shuttle that provide 71% of the launch thrust. The boosters are built in Utah and transported to Florida in segments because they are too large to ship in one piece. Those segments must be joined together on site. And those joints, those critical load-bearing joints, are sealed by rubber rings called O-rings. Here is the fact that will stop you cold. The engineer who designed the O-ring system, a man named Roger Boisjoly, knew from the very beginning that they were a weak point. As early as 1977, during pre-flight testing, engineers discovered that the O-rings could be damaged by hot exhaust gases burning past them during ignition, a phenomenon they called blow-by. They flagged it, they documented it, they moved on. Because the shuttle had a schedule to keep. The first shuttle, Columbia, launches on April 12, 1981. It is stunning. It works. America erupts in celebration. Over the next 4 years, NASA completes 24 successful missions. The O-rings show signs of damage on several flights. The damage is noted, the risk is reclassified as acceptable, the flights continue. Roger Boisjoly watches each launch with growing dread. He is not sleeping well. The year is 1984, and Ronald Reagan has just been re-elected by a landslide. NASA needs a public relations win. The agency is under pressure to demonstrate that space is accessible, not just for astronauts, but for everyone. And so the President of the United States announces a program that will electrify the nation, the Teacher in Space Project. Imagine you are a school teacher in Concord, New Hampshire in 1985. You're 36 years old, you love your students more than anything, and you have just been selected from 11,000 applicants to become the first civilian in space. Her name is Sharon Christa McAuliffe, and she is going to change everything. Christa, as everyone calls her, is not an astronaut by training. She's a wife, a mother of two, a social studies teacher who believes that ordinary people belong in space. She plans to teach 2 lessons live from orbit, watched by millions of school children across America. She becomes the face of mission STS-51L. Her warmth is magnetic. Her laugh is infectious. The cameras love her. Joining her on Challenger are 6 other crew members, each remarkable in their own right. Commander Francis Dick Scobie, a former Air Force test pilot with the quiet authority of a man who has stared down danger before. Pilot Michael Smith, flying his first shuttle mission, calling it a great adventure. Mission Specialist Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, 3 trailblazers who had shattered barriers of race and gender to reach this moment. And Payload Specialist Gregory Jarvis, an engineer from Hughes Aircraft who had waited years for his seat on this flight. 7 people, 1 dream, and a launch scheduled for January 28, 1986. But the night before the launch, January 27th, something extraordinary happens in a teleconference room in Utah. Something that history will never forget. The temperature in Cape Canaveral is dropping hard. The forecast calls for lows of 18 degrees Fahrenheit, far colder than any previous shuttle launch. Roger Boisjoly and his colleague Arnie Thompson have been tracking this for days. They know what cold does to rubber O-rings. They know the rings lose their flexibility. They know the seals can fail. That night, Boisjoly and a group of Thiokol engineers present 13 charts of data to NASA management, pleading for a launch delay. They are terrified. Boisjoly writes in his notes, "This is it. If we don't stop this launch, people will die." NASA's response is brutal in its bluntness. One manager, Lawrence Mulloy, snaps, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" And then comes the moment that will haunt Thiokol management forever. The company's vice president, Jerald Mason, turns to the engineers and says 4 words that seal the crew's fate. Take off your engineering hat. The engineers are told to vote as managers, not as engineers. The launch recommendation is reversed. The data is set aside. And in the early morning hours of January 28, 1986, as ice forms on the launch gantry at Kennedy Space Center, Roger Boisjoly goes home and cannot sleep. He knows what is coming. It is 6 a.m. at Kennedy Space Center, and the world is frozen. Literally. Ice crews are walking the launch structure, documenting icicles on the gantry that are 16 inches long. Temperatures have fallen to 29 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, 15 degrees below the coldest previous shuttle launch. Some crew members' family members, standing at the viewing area with cameras and American flags, are shivering in the cold. Christa McAuliffe's students are gathered around television sets in classrooms across America, waiting. You are standing on that viewing platform. The air is sharp and bitter in your lungs. Steam rises from your breath. In the distance, Challenger gleams white in the pale morning sun, mounted on its twin boosters, surrounded by ice. It is 4.5 million pounds of engineered fire pointed at the sky. At 8 a.m., NASA managers receive the ice inspection report. They see the photographs. They know the temperature. They launch anyway. At 11:37:53 a.m., Challenger's 3 main engines ignite. The roar hits your chest like a physical blow. The ground shakes. Fire pours across the launch pad. For one breathtaking second, Challenger is the most magnificent thing you have ever seen. At 11:38 a.m., the shuttle clears the tower. The crowd erupts. Scobie's voice crackles over the radio. "Houston, we have roll program." Mission Control responds, "Roger, roll, Challenger." Those are the last normal words spoken. At 0.678 seconds after ignition, less than 1 second, a puff of black smoke appears at the base of the right solid rocket booster. The O-ring, cold and stiff, has failed to seal. Superheated gas is already escaping, but the breach seals itself temporarily with residue, and the shuttle climbs. For 59 seconds, everything looks perfect. At 59 seconds, Challenger hits a region of high-altitude wind shear. a phenomenon that day's meteorological data predicted perfectly, but nobody had the authority to act on. The aerodynamic forces on the vehicle spiked to 2.5 times the maximum expected load. The temporary seal breaks open. The flame reappears. At 64.66 seconds, the flame has breached the external fuel tank, which holds 385,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen. At 72 seconds, the strut connecting the right booster to the fuel tank fails. At 73.137 seconds, everything ends. At an altitude of 46,000 feet and a speed of 1,977 miles per hour, the external tank ruptures. The aerodynamic forces rip the vehicle apart instantly. The cabin module, intact, separates from the explosion and arcs upward. There is a pause in mission control. No one speaks. Flight Director Jay Green keeps his voice flat. Downrange, search for any survivors. On the tracking screen, the two solid rocket boosters continue flying in opposite directions, driverless, spiraling, like the most horrible fireworks anyone has ever seen. Christa McAuliffe students are watching on television in their classrooms. Here is the fact that nobody wants to say aloud, but that the NASA investigation later confirmed. The crew almost certainly survived the initial breakup. The crew compartment was designed to withstand the forces of structural failure. 3 of the crew members' emergency oxygen packs, personal egress air packs, were found manually activated at the crash site. Someone was alive after the explosion. Someone was conscious. For the 2 minutes and 45 seconds it took the cabin to fall 46,000 feet to the Atlantic Ocean below, at least 3 of the 7 were breathing. The impact with the ocean at an estimated 207 miles per hour was not survivable. The silence in mission control lasts exactly 4 seconds. Then the voices come, calm, professional, trained for everything except this. 30 miles away in the viewing stands, thousands of people stand completely still, eyes skyward, watching the twin smoke trails spiral in the blue morning air. Nobody moves. Nobody understands. And then the PA system crackles. We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. President Reagan was scheduled to give his State of the Union address that evening. He postponed it. Instead, he stood before the nation and spoke words written by speechwriter Peggy Noonan that would become immortal. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them. This morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. But even as the nation mourned, the machinery of accountability was stirring. Reagan appointed the Rogers Commission, a 13-member panel including former Secretary of State William Rogers, legendary test pilot Chuck Yeager, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman, and former astronaut Sally Ride. They were given 120 days to find the truth. Richard Feynman found it in 11 minutes. In one of the most dramatic moments in the history of public inquiry, Feynman, at a formal commission hearing, reached into a glass of ice water, pulled out a piece of O-ring rubber he had obtained that morning, squeezed it in a C-clamp, and held it underwater for exactly the temperature recorded at launch. When he released it, the rubber did not spring back. I believe this has some significance for our investigation, he said quietly. The room went silent. The commission found what Roger Boisjoly had been screaming for years. The O-rings were the cause. Cold temperatures were the cause. But more damning still, the decision-making culture at NASA was the cause. Engineers have been overruled by managers. Data had been reinterpreted to support political necessity. The launch schedule had become more important than human life. Roger Boisjoly testified before the commission with complete honesty, describing the night before the launch in minute detail. It destroyed his career. Thiokol colleagues stopped speaking to him. He was reassigned to a position with no responsibilities. He eventually left the company, suffered post-traumatic stress for years, and spent the rest of his life traveling to universities, telling engineering students the story of what happens when you stay silent when you know the truth. He called it his penance. The shuttle program was grounded for 32 months. It returned to flight in 1988 with redesigned O-rings and new management protocols. But the deeper cultural problem, the one Feynman warned about in a personal appendix to the commission report, writing that NASA's decision-making had fallen into a pattern of wishful thinking, would resurface 17 years later. In 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated on re-entry, killing all 7 of its crew, because managers had once again overruled engineers who had identified a fatal risk to the thermal protection system. 2 disasters, 14 lives, the same root cause. Challenger did not break apart because of a rubber ring. Challenger broke apart because institutions are capable of convincing themselves that what they wish were true is actually true, and because the people who know better are not always the people with the power to act. Roger Boisjoly died in January 2012, almost exactly 26 years after the disaster. He never stopped speaking about it. He never stopped mourning. In one of his final interviews, he was asked if he regretted blowing the whistle, given what it had cost him professionally and personally. He paused for a long time. Would I do it again? Yes. Absolutely yes. Because the alternative is living with something far worse than losing a job. 7 people left this earth on a cold Tuesday morning in January 1986, believing they were going to change the world. They did, just not in the way any of them imagined. Their names, Scobie, Smith, Resnick, Onizuka, McNair, Jarvis, McAuliffe, are carved into the Space Mirror Memorial at Kennedy Space Center, where the Florida sun still shines on them every single day. The sky is still blue over Cape Canaveral. Rockets still launch. But every single NASA safety engineer who has come after 1986, Challenger with them, a ghost in every decision, a voice in every meeting that says, speak up, speak up, speak up. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what courage and conscience truly cost, consider subscribing so you never miss a story like this one. Drop the crew's names in the comments below. Let's make sure they are remembered. They deserve at least that much.